All right, here we go with our second session tonight under the title of my lecture, God's Continuing Mission. Continuing. Well, who would think that God wouldn't continue, right? He's God, so certainly He's going to continue. Is His plan perfect? Well, when we look at it from the human standpoint and see the failures of human beings, we can say, well, it's certainly not perfect. But you know, God has His plan. And if He can't use us, He's going to use somebody else. And He's going to get the glory to Himself. Now, I start out about this. There are 3 points under this session. First one, the division of the kingdom. And I start out by saying again that Israel's message to the other nations was proclaiming the name of the Lord. And this encapsulated what we call the very essence of the gospel. And we talk about the gospel. What is the gospel? Well, we say it's centered in John 3:16. Well, it's true. It's true. But as we've already developed the message of Israel that God gave them, it was declare the name of the Lord, showing forth that the Lord is being gracious, merciful, loving, and forgiving when true repentance is manifested. Now that's important, isn't it? It's very important. Becoming a Christian is just not saying the words. It's just not following the example of somebody you admire. It's a relationship between me and the Lord. Between you and the Lord, isn't it? And it has to be a heartfelt relationship. Well, we're going to say here regarding Israel as a nation that after God had formed them, in the process of the 400-year sojourn in Egypt that they went through, God built them from a family of 70 people to over 1 million, maybe as many as 2 million. Now that's a great advance, isn't it? Expansion of these people. Well, we've talked about how Moses led Israel out of Egypt and all of the great miracles that were performed there, and then the crossing of their going through the Red Sea, should I say. And then how they were led by Joshua into the land. We talked about that in our last lecture, where God intended for them to become that witness to the Gentile nations. Now notice what I say here. However, in spite of God's gracious, bountiful provision and direction, Israel what? Consistently and persistently, those 2 words, consistently and persistently continued on the downward trail into compromise and what we have developed in what we're saying, and is true, henotheistic idolatry. Okay? Now, following the death of Joshua, Israel plunged into that long period of spiritual darkness. You can count 7 cycles, can we not? The Dark Ages in Israel's period. Okay? 7 cycles of oppression. They turned away from the Lord. God put them under the oppression of the jurisdiction of the surrounding nations, whether it was the Philistines or so on and so forth. And then when they cried out to the Lord, God would deliver them. So there was that 7 cycles that they went through, many years. And of course, as I say here, at the end of each of these cycles, when they called out to the Lord, that God delivered them. Okay? And but you know, the oppression had to become unbearable. Almost being wiped out as a people. But God didn't allow it to go any further. But one thing is true. God always got glory in the process. His name was always declared and became known to more and more people. And maybe to all the people of the world. Well, the last book of that book of Judges, it pretty much describes that long period of darkness, I say. It reads, and this is Judges 21 and verse 25, and it reads, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. You know, that's pretty much a situation in our country today, isn't it? Situation ethics we hear about. And it's supposed to be okay as long as you're not hurting somebody else. You can do anything or say anything or commit any act, quote unquote, as long as it is judged as not in our courts of law as hurting somebody else. Everything is okay. Okay? Well, the statement here that Israel had no king, I say, is just a statement. This is the last paragraph on the first column, page 34. I say it was not meant to imply the statement, Israel has no king, was not meant to imply that this was the primary reason for Israel's degradation, their downfall. Israel had come to think that this was their problem, that they didn't have a king. Okay? But of course, it wasn't that at all. The real reason, I say, was her unrelenting refusal to follow God and His mission purpose. She just wanted to do what she wanted to do, regardless of the sweeping consequences. Well, that's where we are in America today, right here. Now, during the end of this dark period, the prophet Samuel appeared. And what a wonderful story about this young man who came to the Lord and served the Lord, grew up, etc., etc. There is no dark blotch, no problems in Samuel's life as such. But there was a problem with his family, wasn't it? His sons didn't follow the Lord. And all the terrible things they did. Well, in a sense, Samuel was judged because of it, wasn't he? But God used Samuel in a great, great way throughout the period, this closing period of these 7 cycles in the history of Israel, which is described in the book of Judges. So it was at the end, I say, of Samuel's life, when the elders of Israel came to him and said, "Look, Samuel, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the other nations." Like all the other nations. What the Lord said to Samuel when he came to the Lord for direction about this request, I say, pretty much describes the depth of their rebellion against God. God said, quote, "Heed the voice of the people." He's saying this to Samuel. "Heed the voice of the people in all they say to you. For they have not rejected you. They have rejected me, that I would not reign over them." 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 7. So, we all know the story. Their first king was Saul, wasn't it? And he started out great, but not too far down the road, he was a complete failure, wasn't he? And God removed him. And then God brought David, the young man, in his youth, brought him to the kingship. And he was probably the best of all that followed, wasn't he? Now, he had problems. In spite of King David's sin and human failings, however, God described him, and this description is in Acts chapter 13, verse 22, where David is described there as a man after my own heart. Okay? Well, he had problems, didn't he? But he had a heart for God. There's the point. He was a seeker after God all of his life. God used him in a marvelous way. Even when God brought him up short because of his sin, what happened? He acknowledged it and turned away and followed the Lord. So God used him in marvelous ways for his mission purpose in the surrounding nations. Did he not? It was through David, I say, that all the surrounding nations were finally subdued and made to realize that God was not the tribal God of Israel, but that he was the almighty, living God of all nations. Well, Solomon, David's son, started out very well, didn't he? God used him in two distinct ways. First of all, I say he was God's instrument to build a temple in Jerusalem. Remember, God had told David, no, you're not going to build it. Your son is going to build it. That was Solomon. Well, Solomon said in his great prayer of dedication of the temple, and that dedication prayer in 1 Kings, I refer to this so often, my Bible just opens up there at that spot. 1 Kings chapter 8. And possibly we referred you to this, but in this, the temple is built in Jerusalem by Solomon. And God is using him. This is the very peak of his service for God. This is the reason, this is the place that God put Israel in Palestine, the center of the world. Why? So he could reach out to all the nations of the world, okay? So here in chapter 8 of 1 Kings, we have Solomon speaking, and he has his sermon and his prayer in dedication of this dedication and the purpose of it. And we may have mentioned it before, but I just point out again that in verse 22, and Solomon says here, Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the congregation of Israel, and he spread out his hands toward heaven, and he prayed, "There's no God in heaven above or on earth below like you, who keep your covenant and your mercy." Here's the message, isn't it? The gospel message. "With your servants who walk before you with" what? "All your heart." That's the meaning. That's the purpose, isn't it? Okay, so the prayer goes on. And in verse 28 he says, "Yet regard the prayer of your servant and his supplication, O Lord my God, and listen to the cry and the prayer which your servant," speaking of himself, "is making before you today." And what does he say in that prayer? "That your eyes may be open toward this temple night and day, toward the place of which you said," notice, "My name shall be there, that you may hear his voice." And then it skips over quickly to verse 41 as the prayer continues. And notice how he ends up this prayer. In verse 41, he says, "Moreover, concerning a foreigner who is not of your people, Israel, but has come from a far country," for what reason? "For your name's sake." For they will hear of your great name and your strong hand and your outstretched arm when he comes and prays toward this temple. And he says and goes on, here in heaven your dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to you. For what reason? That all peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your people Israel, and that they may know that this what? This temple which I have built is called by your name. And it goes on and expands on this. And notice the culmination in verse 59 as we come to the end of this prayer. And he says, continuing to pray, and may these words of mine, with which I have made supplication before the Lord, be near the Lord our God, day and night, that he may maintain the cause of his servant and the cause of his people Israel, as each day may require. Now notice the next verse. That all the peoples of the earth. Who does that include? That's everybody, isn't it? That all peoples of the earth may know that the Lord is God and that there is no other. And then I close by just emphasizing going to chapter 9. And it says in verse 6, but if you or your sons at all, God is saying to Solomon now, he's saying to Solomon, but if you or your sons at all turn from following me, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes which I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then what did God say? Then I will cut off Israel from the land which I have given them, and this house which I have sanctified for my what? For my name. I will cast out of my sight. Israel will be a proverb and a byword among what? All peoples. Solomon knew why God had called him. Solomon knew why God put him in this place. And he understood it. And he prayed to God, and that was the purpose of his heart, and he knew that's why God had put him here. He was given the wisdom from God, wisdom greater than any other living person at the time. And they came, didn't they? They came from all over the world to hear that wisdom. Okay? And then what happened? Well, Solomon turned away in his old age to serve other gods. He became a henotheist in the worst sense of the word. And God detested it. And so what happened? God continues his mission, but something happens. Well, Israel, I want to emphasize, the reason God had put them in Jerusalem at this time, had set up the temple that all the peoples of the world could come, this was God's continuing mission. This is what he wanted. This is why he prepared Israel over a period of over 400 years to be here for this purpose. And then it began to collapse. But this was the centripetal, see, pulling the peoples in to Israel for his great mission purpose. Well, okay. And you at the bottom of column 1 on page 35, the next to the last sentence above the last paragraph, and I quote for you 1 Kings 10:24, and it says, and all the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. Here was how the mission purpose for God was working in the world, and what he wanted to, how he wanted to use Israel as a nation. And as we said, what happened? The sad sequel to this story, as we've already said, is that although Solomon was used mightily by the Lord in helping to fulfill his mission purpose, Solomon sowed the seeds of his own destruction. That always happens, isn't it? You know, no group in the history of the world can say that their leaders have always served God and never had any problems. Oh, how this has happened over and over again. You say, why a pastor or a priest can be used so mightily, and then all of a sudden, through temptation and sin, are brought down? Why does it happen? How can it happen? It happens so, doesn't it? But does God stop? No. He continues his mission. So I go on to mention on the top of the second column on top of page 35, the unbelieving wives which he married from other nations, quote, turned his heart, Solomon's heart, after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. Okay? So deceived, and they deceived and led him astray, and there you have the worship of for the gods of Moab and Ammon in 1 Kings chapter 11. It speaks of it. And I'm going to say, because of this rebellion that Solomon did, God divided the kingdom, and 10 tribes to the north and 2 to the south, under his son Jeroboam. And through this action of dividing Israel, God's intention was certainly to punish the house of Solomon. Yes. However, that was only part of the drama. God's overriding purpose, okay, was to maintain the spread of the message of his name among the nations. And I go on to say, in the scattering of Israel throughout the nations, God made it known to those nations that he was the eternal, living creator God of all nations. Without question. And to speak about the exiles. God divided Israel in 931 BC. 931. And the capital of the northern kingdom was Samaria. And in Jesus' time they were called the Samaritans. You have that great story in John chapter 4 where Jesus went over the fence. You know what I mean? He said, I must go through Samaria. And he took, we talked about it before, haven't we? He took the disciples there at the well of Sychar to teach them something. Okay? And he did, didn't he? He did. But also a people group was brought out of that. Actually, 2 people groups. We'll talk about that later. But the 200 years later, in 722 BC, God sent the northern kingdom, and here's where we have the dispersion of the northern 10 tribes, which are called the lost tribes of Israel. Okay? Are you a member of the lost tribe of Israel? I don't know. There are some in Ethiopia, aren't there? Okay? I've seen them in Israel. Those Ethiopian Jews. Have you heard that story? That's a marvelous story as well. Okay? Well, and then in 586 BC, the southern kingdom, the 2 tribes left in Jerusalem, was sent into Babylon exile, which lasted what? 70 years. Okay? And this is what historians call the diaspora. And I'm sure you've heard of that term before, haven't you? Is there a nodding of the heads? The diaspora. Okay? And actually, the diaspora, I understand, is the peoples that did not come back to Jerusalem after the 70 years captivity. Those that remained in the dispersion as I understand that that's really the meaning of the word diaspora. All right? And so I go on to say, at the bottom of page 35, last column, excuse me, by dividing Israel north and south, they were sent into two separate exiles, and thus in and among more different ethnic people groups. And I go on to say God explained this action to the through the prophet Zechariah when he said, in Zechariah chapter 7, verse 14, he said, I scattered them with a whirlwind among all the nations which they had not known. All the nations. I go on to say God also revealed to Ezekiel the reason for this action. And this is a quotation I give you from chapter 36 of Ezekiel, beginning with verse 22. And I quote, I do not do this for your sake, O house of Israel, but for what reason? For my holy name's sake, which you have profaned among the nations where you sin. And I will sanctify my great name, which has been profaned among the nations. Now notice this, the nations shall know that I am the Lord. Irregardless of their action, they're going to find out. They're going to know. So Israel refused to properly and completely carry out God's mission, which is purpose for all the nations. Therefore God, while he punished Israel, fulfilled that mission purpose. God revealed to the prophet Ezekiel more details about this scattering process. It's the way it's described in English. He said, there in Ezekiel 5, verses 11 and 12, he said, my eyes will not spare, nor will I have any pity. 1/3 of you will die of the pestilence and be consumed with famine in your midst, and 1/3 shall fall by the sword all around you. And I will scatter another 1/3 to all the winds. I wonder if there's not a nation on earth where the Jews haven't been scattered to. I would say almost everywhere, isn't it? For some reason. And I go on to say of this scattered 1/3 diaspora, which the prophets call the remnant, okay? The remnant. A great number turned back to and followed the Lord. That's the way the Lord does it. He's sending problems and heartaches and so forth. You know, he brings us back to himself. Well, isn't that God's mercy? A lot of times we don't want to think of it that way. But it is God's mercy. It's God's plan, okay? And we've got to try and see that. So under great persecution, they became faithful, effective witnesses of his great name. Now, I mentioned Daniel. Of course, he went from Jerusalem, didn't he, to Babylon. Probably in that first wave being taken from Jerusalem in 586 BC. Okay, God's greatest witness of the Old Testament period. Was he a witness to the whole world? He certainly was, wasn't he? You know, most Sunday school people, children in our Western world, think of Daniel in what way? He was a great hero, right? I wonder how many are taught, have been taught, that he was the greatest missionary that God used in that day. Do we speak of that perspective? That's what he was, wasn't he? He reached the whole world because he dared to go to the lion's den, okay? He dared to worship God. So the proclamation King Darius of Persia sent through his entire world empire after God stopped the mouths of the lions and saved the life of Daniel. And what was the proclamation I give you in Daniel 6 verses 10 to 28, where it says, to all peoples, nations and languages, You know, Babylon is the greatest empire that's ever been on the face of the earth. Babylon. Okay? They reached out to the whole world. And God, through this, reached the whole world. And he said in that decree, I make that in every dominion of my kingdom men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. Why? Because he's the living God, steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the very end. Okay? Well, this working by the Spirit of God through the diaspora is called by the missiological term. Now, have you heard this before? God's involuntary goal mechanism. This is centrifugal, isn't it? Going out. God's involuntary goal mechanism. Okay? Daniel was a willing participant in this part of God's mission purpose. But it was involuntary action, wasn't it? Isn't that true? It was involuntary. Daniel was a young man. What was he taken? He was taken captive. Now, how about Joseph? When they went down to Egypt, you know, he was deceived by his brothers, wasn't he? He was sold into slavery. You think he cried that night when he wanted to see mother? Okay? What do you think? You think he understood all about it? Well, God had revealed some wonderful things to him, hadn't he? He certainly had. But it was involuntary. He didn't. God didn't say, Joseph, I want you to go down to Egypt. I'm going to use you in a mighty way. No. But he understood. Somehow, you do not see one blemish, not one blemish, on the life of Joseph or Daniel. Not one. Were they perfect? Did they slip and fall somewhere? God doesn't say so, does it? Now, David was spoken of as a man after God's own heart. But did David slip and fall? Yes. But we have that marvelous Psalm 51 of repentance, turning to God and following God. And that's why God could say that David was a man after my own heart. So we do not have any kind of a story like that with Joseph or with Daniel. But God used them, didn't he? He used them. So notice that next paragraph, the second one on page 36, second column, second paragraph. I say, in observing the opposite side of this involuntary goal mechanism principle, mention could be made of Jonah. Okay, mention, I say, who has been called God's reluctant missionary. Okay? He went, didn't he? When he went kicking and screaming, didn't he? He got on the boat going the other way, and God had to throw him overboard to the big whale, the big fish. Swallowed him up, okay? We're going to talk about him a little later, I say. But he knew well the message of the name of the Lord, didn't he, Jonah? He knew that God is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abundant in loving kindness. That's revealed in Jonah chapter 4, verse 2. He speaks of God in this regard, okay? Jonah knew very well, I say, that if the Ninevites repented, that God would forgive them, and this was his greatest fear. Why did he fear the Ninevites? We'll talk about that. Well, I go on to say the prophets that served the Lord in both the northern and the southern kingdom at the split of the kingdom knew very well God's mission purpose for the people of the world. All of these prophets, with the exception of Jonah, presented God how? As king, not only of Israel, but of all the nations. See that? Many of these prophets were brought face to face with the false religions of the day and great power encounters. Who could we speak of besides Job, besides Joseph, etc.? Well, we could speak of Isaiah, Jeremiah. How about Elijah and Elisha? God used them marvelous, didn't they? As missionaries to all the other nations. And I go on to say that Elijah, in his confrontation with the prophets of Baal, you know, I've been there. I've stood in that area and thought about it, where Elijah did that marvelous miracle, and the prophets of Baal were all slain, and then Elijah got scared, didn't he? We talked about it last hour. He got worried about who? The king's wife, remember? Jezebel. And he took off for the wilderness, didn't he? Okay? You say, God provided all those miracles, and then he ran from the Lord. How you say, how could that be? He trusted God with his own life, where there was power. And God used him. And then he ran from this lady. You ladies have power. Did you know that? Well, anyway, we're going here to the post-exile witness, the last one in this lecture. The post-exile witness. And I start by saying the Babylonian captivity of Israel marked a turning point in Israel's history, second only to the Exodus. This captivity, second only to the Exodus out of Egypt. After the prescribed 70 years that we've already mentioned, captivity in Babylon, listen, the majority of the Jews remained scattered throughout the world empires. Only a few went back under Ezra and Nehemiah. Only some 42,000 of them returned under the leadership of Zerubbabel, remember? God did, however, I say, accomplish a very important thing in the religious life of Israel during this long exile. They were cured forever of their idolatrous tendencies. Okay? Cured forever. Throughout the rule of the Babylonian emperors and the Medo-Persians, the next empire that came on, and then the Greco-Roman world, they strenuously maintained the integrity of their religious faith, so much so that they were known as, quote-unquote, the second race. The second race. Quite distinct from the Greeks and the Romans. For this reason, they were admired and detested at the same time. Well, this has been true of the Jews down through the ages, hasn't it? It was during this post-exile period, leading down to the advent of the suffering Messiah, that Israel, as the diaspora, became a tremendous outreach force. And I cannot emphasize that enough. Literally taking the message of the Lord to the ends of the earth. God had said, if you're not going to do what I want you to do so I can bring the people to you, I'm going to send you out among them. That's what he did. And I say for the first time in her history, Israel became actively engaged in winning converts from the Gentile nations. And how did they do this? One of the chief characteristics was what we call proselytism. Proselytism. Is that a bad word? Well, it was good in this sense, okay? From what the Lord Jesus said about it, their proselytizing activities must have been both intensive and extensive. Well, you can read that. You see, God used them throughout the Greco-Roman world during those last centuries before the coming of the Messiah. Used them marvelously in the synagogue system, as I explain here. Now, back home in Jerusalem, the rabbis there were different. The Gentiles were not welcome in the Jerusalem area, but out in the boondocks they were welcome, okay? And I say this witnessing ministry went forth from the synagogues that were built throughout the empire, wherever the Jews went. Synagogue is, have you studied Greek yet? Synagoge. Synagogue is a Greek word meaning to gather together, or a gathering of people, more or less like a congregation, okay? Church, but it's a gathering is the idea. These were built wherever there were at least 10 male leaders, the synagogue. I've been in a synagogue in Jerusalem. In fact, we had a service at a synagogue on a Sunday morning where they had a Sabbath worship the day before, okay? But anyway, wherever 10 male leaders became centers of Jewish religious and social life. The synagogue that was never intended to be a substitute for a temple, no. Was primarily a place of teaching, a teaching institution. Their leaders were rabbis, not priests, and notice, all the Gentiles who lived around them were freely welcomed out in the Greco-Roman world. And therein received instruction about what? The living Creator God. And I go on to say, not a few Roman citizens were impressed by at least 3 features of Judaism that were preached in the synagogues. Number 1, the concept of one high God. Not henotheism now. One high God, who created, sustains, and rules all things, was clearly superior to the polytheism all around them, okay? Number 2, Judaism at that time stressed a lifestyle of moral responsibility. And that was important in light of the terrible immorality that was all around, okay? Third, it was a religion of a very ancient and stable tradition in stark contrast to the faddish cults in their society. I'm going to say the Greco-Roman world was saturated, as I've already said, with polytheism. It is said that the Greeks had some 30,000 gods. Can you imagine that? A culture that was supposed to be the epitome of education, sophistication, social responsibility, and yet this was their life, okay? Most of them gods of lust, I say, immorality. These gods were said to be more immoral than the men who worshiped them, okay? Many of these Gentiles turned with a sigh of relief to the ethical monotheism of Judaism because they were completely disillusioned by their religions. In this pagan Greco-Roman world, I say, immorality ranked with what? Idolatry as the 2 great sins. There they are. Well, how does it rank in America today? Okay? The large cities were literally cesspools of iniquity. Israel, as a result of the punishment and preparation that God had given them through the Babylonian captivity and dispersion, had finally become the instrument, notice, of witness God intended for them in the beginning, and had risen to the occasion to become a very effective witness. Okay? Very effective witness. The converts that were made through them, I say, this ministry, and these synagogues, were of 2 types. And I'm sure you've heard the 2 types. First of all is the proselyte, and the other is the God-fearer. The God-fearer. What's the difference? Well, I'm going to say the proselyte became a Jew in every respect. Circumcision, the whole bit. The God-fearer, however, was a believer in every respect, but did not receive the surgical rite of circumcision. What's a good illustration of this? How about Cornelius, that's spoken of in Acts chapter 10? Remember that story? Have we talked about that yet? Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. Remember, God spoke to Cornelius, didn't he? You know, does God speak to people like this today, you think? I think he does. I've witnessed the situation. Okay? God does speak. But God spoke to Cornelius. And what did he say there? There was a certain man in Caesarea, Acts chapter 10 verse 1, called Cornelius. Who is he? A centurion of what is called the Italian regiment. Well, where did Cornelius come from? From Rome, didn't he? That's where he was trained. And now he's sent with his regiment down to Jerusalem. Was that just a coincidence? No. Okay? God said, a devout man and one who feared God with all his household and gave alms generously to the people and prayed to God always. Where did he learn about this? In the synagogue. Probably back in Rome. Okay? He learned about all of this. And about the 9th hour, God spoke to him, didn't he, on this particular day. And he saw a vision of an angel and God coming in and saying, what? Cornelius. Did Cornelius say, like Samuel, who are you, Lord? Remember, God had to speak Samuel, what? Third time, didn't he, as a little boy? God got his heart, didn't he? But what is it, Lord, he said. He'd evidently spoken to the Lord before, hadn't he? Seems like it anyway. So he said, God said your prayers have been answered. So I want you to go to Peter. And he's going to tell you what the next step is. Now, let me ask you a question and we'll deal with this later. When was Cornelius saved? Before he met Peter or after? Well, I don't think we need to answer that question. But God had planned for him these steps, hadn't he? And Cornelius was not rebellious. He was ready, eagerly to receive each step as God led him. How has God led us individually? We all have a story, don't we? How God has dealt with us. Okay? But you know this story in chapter 10, I say, of the book of Acts, is more about the conversion of Peter than of Cornelius. God had a greater problem of dealing with Peter, getting him ready, didn't he? To go to Cornelius' house and present him the truth of the Messiah. He had more trouble with Peter than he did with Cornelius, didn't he? Okay? But God did it in his marvelous, marvelous plans for the... And so we go on here in continuing this. I say going back, I said that first of all the proselyte was the number one, and the God-fearer, okay, who became a Jew, and who did not become a Jew, and that was Cornelius, okay? It was Cornelius. Excuse me. On that third paragraph, column 1, page 38, I say this: it's quite evident that the purpose of the Jewish missionary effort of the diaspora during this intertestamental period was not to create more Jews, but an ever-expanding multitude of God-fearing Gentiles. See that? Excuse me. Now I say Cornelius was one of these. How many more you think there were? that God prepared in the Greco-Roman world? Well, it's hard to tell, isn't it? Well, anyway, I go on to say, I've already mentioned that this did not happen in the Palestinian era, in Jerusalem era, but it did happen out in the Greco-Roman world. And God used people like Cornelius in a marvelous way. And I go on to say that out of these groups of God-fearing Gentiles who were attracted to Jewish monotheism, see that? Became a great body of believers for the Christian church. That these God-fearers were a people especially prepared to accept the gospel of Christ is evident from the New Testament references to such converts. And here I mention chapter 10 of Acts. And Acts also chapter 16 and verse 14. And I go on to say in the last sentence on that first column on page 38, this Jewish mission of the diaspora prepared the way for the Christian mission. It prepared the Gentile world, the whole Gentile world, to receive the gospel in that they became accustomed to the idea of what? Conversion to an exclusive monotheistic religion. Okay? And they were ready. God had prepared their hearts. They were ready to receive. And I go on to say in that second paragraph on page 38, column 2, as the many generations came and went, for these thousands of Jews scattered throughout the Greco-Roman world, most of them were no longer conversant in the Hebrew language. Now here is an important side of the story. You know, the generations had gone by and these Jews forgot how to speak Hebrew. Okay? I had an instant experience on Sunday. And one of the visitors at our church was a young lady, looked to be about 30, who was Japanese. And one of the ladies said, you know, she speaks Japanese fluently. Well, I went and talked to her. And she understood me very well, but she did not speak it fluently. She had to ask me in English what I said. You know, and she said, well, you speak a lot better Japanese than I do. Well, you see what I'm talking about? She grew up in Japan some, okay? Do you have this problem with Korean? That's what when you go out with people who, the problem, isn't it? And the next generation, and the next generation goes by, they lose the language, okay? And this happened in the diaspora, in the Greco-Roman world. So what did they have to do? They had to get a new Bible. And that was when the Septuagint, we've talked about this, haven't we? That's when the Septuagint Bible was written, okay? And I explain it here. The LXX, which means 70 in Greek counting, okay? And it was translated by 70 scholars, is who it was. Well, anyway, my point was that in these synagogues where the Gentiles, the Romans came and were accepted and received, they had a common language. They didn't have to learn Hebrew. It was in their language. See what I mean? And oh, how important that is in any people group. Okay? To be in their language, to be in their culture. Okay? Well, you see, God prepared this. And this happened about 200 years before the coming of Christ. I think we've talked about that. So I say in closing, it's more than a little evident that God had another purpose other than just the need of a vernacular version of the Scriptures for the diaspora. In a very short time, this Septuagint Scriptures became a powerful tool. For the rabbis who were teaching Gentiles in the synagogues, this was the Bible of Jesus and the apostles. Okay? The fact was mentioned by James in his speech before the very first missionary council. And here again I take you to the book of Acts, chapter 15, and verses 19 and 21. Chapter 15, verses 19 and 21. Now this is at the great council when Paul comes back and they have this council. And if you read this chapter 15, the purpose was to decide once and for all, should the Gentiles become Jews? See, this was the big question, not out in the boondocks, but it was the big question in Jerusalem. Okay? Well, it was decided they didn't have to be, as you read this. But notice what is recorded here by James in verse 19 of chapter 15. Therefore, he says, I judge that we should not trouble those from among the Gentiles who are turning to God. See what I'm saying? But that we write to them to abstain from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from being strangled, and from blood. Notice the next verse. Notice. For Moses has had throughout many generations those who preach him in every city, being read where? In the synagogues every Sabbath. Every Sabbath. See the impact of the use of the Septuagint Bible. And here it's recorded to the council in Jerusalem, recorded in the 15th chapter. Okay? Now, in that last closing paragraph, on page 38, column 2, if the scriptures during this intertestamental period had only been in Hebrew, it is doubtful if the Gentiles and Jews in any large numbers would have attended the synagogues. Either one. Isn't that interesting? This intertestamental period was the greatest period for proselytizing or proselyting in the entire history of Israel, and reveals how wonderful was God's preparation for what? The coming of the Messiah. God's plan worked. Folks, it's still working today. God's continuing mission. God bless you.